Hey everybody, my name's Cole, and welcome back to How to Design Levels for Video Games. This episode is actually the second half of an episode where I've been discussing the methods of establishing a concept for a video game level, so I highly recommend watching the first part before this one. Where we left off, we discussed things like limitations, goals, brainstorming ideas, and mechanics for levels. So let's get right into it and continue on. Another thing you should do is to start outlining the objectives that the player will be working towards throughout the course of the level. There are two distinct types of objectives. The first is the primary objective, which is the player's main reason for completing the level in the first place. These are a requirement when designing a level. It most often serves as the endpoint. Meanwhile, smaller objectives, known as sub-objectives, serve as small barriers blocking the player from progressing further in the level. Unlike primary objectives, sub-objectives are not a requirement, but they're necessary depending on the type of level you're trying to make. There are a few different ways that sub-objectives can be implemented into a game. Task-based objectives. With these, the player is given a list of sub-objectives to complete, and are free to go about and complete them in any order. Sequential objectives. A series of sub-objectives where completing one leads into the next, often culminating with the primary objective. Side objectives. Generally optional objectives that players are assigned to complete within a level that rewards them with optional goodies. Often they come in the form of side quests, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Hypothetically speaking, imagine a level that involves traveling to different areas to activate a teleporter in the center of the level. Traveling to the different areas would be the sub-objectives, while activating the teleporter is the primary objective. In order to create the objectives for your level, you should think about the context of the level within the game, and consider its purpose. Depending on the story events or theme of your level, you can narrow down what the primary objective is, and then decide on sub-objectives that tie into it. It's important for your objectives to have a sense of cohesion, and be related to each other in some way, instead of just being totally random. It's also important that your objectives create a satisfying sense of progress for the player. In my level, the objectives are laid out sequentially. The primary objective is to defeat the main boss, but to get there, they have to complete the following sub-objectives. Unlock the bombs, unlock the flippers, find a way into the basement of the dungeon, defeat the mini-boss to unlock the hookshot, use the hookshot to find the boss key, and reach the second floor to fight the main boss. Moving along, you should also decide on some metrics that you'll follow for your level. What's nice about this is that you can apply it to every level that you design for a game, so you only need to really decide on this once. If you know the measurements of everything early on, it can help you make better level design decisions, and it can especially help ensure that everything in your level is always designed correctly. This means you won't make any fundamental mistakes in your design, such as impossible jumps or passageways that the player can't fit through, that would force you to go back and redo them. There are some metrics that already exist within the game, as decided by people such as the game designer, that need to be taken into consideration first, including but not limited to the player's jump height, their size and speed, the range of their abilities, such as weapon ranges, and the size and speed of various enemies. Knowing this, you can then narrow down your own measurements to base the game's levels around. You need to determine that all jumps are possible, the player can fit through all doors and passageways, stairs are the right size, cover points are at the correct height for the player to safely hide behind, objects are spaced far enough apart that the player has enough space to move through them, and the distance of walking from one part of the level to another isn't too far apart that it feels tedious or slow to get there. Since I'm designing my dungeon to be created for Super Dungeon Maker, all of the metrics already existed beforehand. Here's what I had to follow. The game uses a standard grid system, in which one square is equal to a unit of measurement, presumably meters. Most things in the dungeon take up the space of exactly one square, with a small handful of exceptions. In regards to the player's abilities, the hook shot is able to reach across 11 squares. Bombs have a blast radius of 3 squares. The player character moves at a fairly moderate pace. Most enemies move either slower or at roughly the same speed as the player, and they take up 1 square. Bosses, on the other hand, take up 3x3 squares and are faster than the player. One last thing that you're going to want to create for this stage of design is a flowchart that lays out the rough idea for your level's progression from beginning to end. The reason that this is useful is that it helps you to figure out the order of events that take place within your level, without needing to figure out exactly how they would fit within it beforehand. The other benefit of doing this is that it allows you to design your level around what you want to put in it, rather than the other way around. Aside from outlining a specific path for the player, the flowchart can also explain where certain events can create branching paths and deviations in the level. You can also use the flowchart to try and figure out the critical path and the golden path. These are two important terms that you should be familiar with as a level designer. The golden path is the preferred path that the developer intends for the player to take in order to reach the end of the level, which is the intended experience. The critical path, on the other hand, is the quickest possible way that the player can reach the goal. Both are deliberately designed and offer fairly different experiences for the player. Let's use the first level of the original Legend of Zelda game as a demonstration. The golden path would look something like this. The player is expected to grab all of the keys, collect the map and compass, and grab the bow before going to fight the boss and collect the Triforce piece. Now, here is the critical path. Under the right conditions, such as entering the dungeon with bombs in their inventory, the player can choose to skip the map and compass entirely and use the bombs to create shortcuts through the dungeon. They can complete the dungeon by exploring only 13 rooms. It's important to know the distinction between these two paths, and when designing your level, you should try and nail them down early on, so that you can ensure that your level has a good flow. You should try and at least think about them when creating your flowcharts, but ideally you should make your final decision when you create the rough layout of your level. I made a few different versions of my level's flowchart. Here's the original version. Note that I started deciding where there should be locked doors preventing the player from moving forward, and the points during the dungeon where the player would be able to find keys. And here's the version that I settled on in the end. For this one, I also labeled where the boss door and the boss key would be found in the dungeon. And I also showed arrows explaining points where the player can backtrack, and where they're locked into permanent progress. Interestingly enough, a great deal of this flowchart ended up being implemented into the final level, but suffice it to say, my idea still changed quite a bit. Regardless, it greatly helped me to shape the design of the level, as I was able to think about how I would design the level around the order of progression as outlined on the flowchart. I highly recommend that you create one of these flowcharts for every level you design. That's all of the main topics I wanted to cover regarding the concepting phase of level design. It can be tricky to get the ball rolling, but it really does pay off a lot in the later stages of design. Of course, be aware that no matter what you come up with during this stage of the process, there really is no guarantee that a lot of it will stick. So if at any point you're feeling overwhelmed trying to figure all of this out, it's all going to work out down the line and everything will become a lot more straightforward. So that brings us to the end of this episode. I hope that all of this has been useful to you, and you'll be able to get started creating some amazing level concepts. Next episode, we're going to keep this momentum going and start diving deeper into the design and layout phase, where we'll see all of our ideas start to come together to create a layout for our level. I hope you look forward to it. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time.